Number 1. Timothy McVeigh. Oklahoma City bombing. Timothy McVeigh grew up in Pendleton, New York. People who knew him described him as quiet, intelligent, and reserved. He was obsessed with firearms from an early age and later became deeply invested in anti-government literature. After high school, McVeigh joined the United States Army and served during the Gulf War. He was a decorated soldier, but once he left the military, he struggled to find direction. He bounced between jobs, grew increasingly isolated, and surrounded himself with extremist ideas that focused almost entirely on the federal government. By the early 1990s, McVeigh's worldview had hardened. He believed the government was becoming tyrannical, and events like Ruby Ridge in 1992 and the Waco siege in 1993 pushed him even further. He viewed both incidents as proof that federal agencies had turned on American citizens. McVeigh wasn't shy about his anger. He openly discussed revolution and began planning an attack that he believed would send a message. In 1994, McVeigh began making regular trips to Kingman, Arizona, where he met up with two old Army acquaintances, Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier. Nichols, in particular, shared some of McVeigh's anti-government views. The two stockpiled weapons and began acquiring materials needed to make an explosive device. Throughout this period, McVeigh lived under various aliases, traveled constantly, and tried to stay off the radar. Nothing he was doing was legal, but very little of it drew attention. By early 1995, McVeigh had settled on his target, the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. It housed multiple federal agencies, including the ATF, the Secret Service, and the Social Security Administration. McVeigh believed these agencies had overstepped their authority at Waco. He chose April 19th intentionally. It was the second anniversary of the Waco fire. In the months leading up to the attack, McVeigh and Nichols gathered ammonium nitrate, racing fuel, and other components needed for a massive truck bomb. They stored the materials in rented units and barns. McVeigh stole license plates, used fake names, and constantly moved locations to avoid detection. No one realized how close he was to carrying out one of the deadliest acts of domestic terrorism in United States history. On the morning of April 19, 1995, at about 8:57 a.m., McVeigh parked a rented Ryder truck directly in front of the Murrah building. The truck was packed with thousands of pounds of explosive material. McVeigh lit the fuses, exited the vehicle, and walked away. At 9:02 a.m., the bomb detonated. The explosion tore through the building, collapsing large portions of the structure and sending debris across several blocks. The blast killed 168 people, including 19 children who were in a daycare located inside the building. More than 600 others were injured. The attack stunned the nation. It was the deadliest act of homegrown terrorism in American history, and the scene was chaotic. Emergency personnel, firefighters, and volunteers worked around the clock to rescue survivors and recover victims. Footage from that day still stands as some of the most devastating ever captured in a domestic disaster. What McVeigh didn't expect was how quickly he would be caught. 90 minutes after the bombing, an Oklahoma State trooper stopped him on the highway for driving without a license plate. McVeigh was arrested on unrelated weapons charges, still wearing a T-shirt referencing government resistance. While he was in custody, investigators found the axle of the Ryder truck in the rubble. The number traced back to the rental company, and the description given by employees matched McVeigh. 3 days after the attack, McVeigh was charged with the bombing. Investigators discovered a trail of evidence that connected McVeigh and Nichols to the plot. There were receipts for the fertilizer, witness statements from storage facilities, and testimony from Michael Fortier, who admitted he knew the plan ahead of time. The scale of the attack and the brutality of the outcome made the trial one of the most watched of the decade. In 1997, McVeigh was convicted on 11 federal counts, including conspiracy, use of a weapon of mass destruction, and murder. He was sentenced to death. Nichols faced his own trials and was convicted of conspiracy and manslaughter before later being convicted of 161 counts of murder in state court. On June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. He never expressed remorse and maintained his anti-government stance until the end. The Oklahoma City bombing remains a permanent reminder of how a single individual, driven by extremist ideology, can inflict catastrophic damage. The incident led to changes in federal building security, anti-terrorism laws, and domestic intelligence monitoring across the United States. Number 2, Susan Smith, the drowning of Michael and Alexander Smith. Susan Lee Smith lived in Union, South Carolina. Outwardly, she appeared to have a normal life. She worked as a secretary, attended church, and raised her 2 young sons, Michael, who was 3 years old, and Alexander, who was 14 months. But behind that image, her personal life was chaotic. She struggled with depression, financial issues, and a turbulent on-again, off-again relationship with her husband, David Smith. Their marriage involved constant arguments, infidelity, and long periods of separation. In late 1994, Susan became increasingly focused on a man she had been romantically pursuing. He was from a wealthy local family and had made it very clear that he didn't want children in his life. That rejection hit Susan hard. She feared losing the relationship, and she felt cornered by responsibilities she didn't want to face. Instead of seeking help or stepping back from the situation, she made a series of decisions that would lead to one of the most shocking crimes in South Carolina history. On October 25, 1994, Susan Smith appeared on television claiming that her car had been hijacked by an unknown black man who drove off with her 2 sons still strapped inside the vehicle. The story triggered a nationwide search. Police set up roadblocks, deployed helicopters, and brought in federal agents. News outlets across the country covered the case constantly. Susan gave multiple interviews, crying on camera and pleading for the safe return of her children. The emotional appeals made her one of the most recognized faces in the country during those 9 days. However, investigators noticed inconsistencies from the beginning. Susan kept changing details about the direction the supposed carjacker drove, the stoplights she remembered, the position of her vehicle, and the timeline of events. The route she described had no logical pattern. Detectives also noticed that, despite her televised breakdowns, her behavior fluctuated dramatically when the cameras were off. She never provided a clear description of the attacker, and police couldn't locate any witnesses who saw the incident happen. As the search continued, detectives pressed Susan with more questions. Physical evidence didn't support her story, and surveillance from nearby businesses contradicted her claims. Susan eventually broke down during an interview with investigators. She admitted that there had never been a carjacker. Her story was a lie from the start. On November 3, 1994, she confessed to driving her car into John D. Long Lake with her sons still strapped in their car seats. The car drifted forward, entered the lake, and submerged. Susan exited the vehicle before it entered the water. The boys drowned inside. Law enforcement immediately went to the lake, and early the next morning, divers found the car submerged in about 18 feet of water. The discovery confirmed Susan's confession and ended the nationwide search. The confession stunned the public. For over a week, millions believed her story, and many prayed for the boys' safe return. Susan Smith was charged with 2 counts of murder. The prosecution described her actions as deliberate and planned. They pointed to her relationship with the man who didn't want children and argued that Susan viewed her sons as obstacles. The defense argued that she suffered from severe mental health issues, including depression and suicidal ideation, and that her actions were influenced by emotional instability. The trial began in 1995. News cameras captured nearly every moment outside the courthouse, and the case became international news. The prosecution presented the timeline, the confession, and testimony about Susan's state of mind in the days before the drownings. The defense brought in psychological experts and emphasized her long-term struggles with mental health. But the strongest evidence was still Susan's own admission and the recovery of the vehicle. In July 1995, Susan Smith was convicted of murdering Michael and Alexander. She did not receive the death penalty. Instead, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Her earliest parole eligibility is in 2025. The case left a deep impact on the public because of the initial deception. Susan's fabricated story about a kidnapping created fear, stirred racial tension, and consumed national resources. Her emotional televised pleas became some of the most replayed footage of the decade, and her eventual confession became one of the most shocking moments in the case. Today, Susan Smith remains incarcerated in South Carolina. The drownings of Michael and Alexander Smith are still referenced as one of the most devastating and widely publicized child murder cases of the 1990s. The investigation stands as a reminder of how quickly public perception can shift once the truth emerges, and how a single lie can set off a chain of events reaching far beyond one community. Number 3, Yolanda Saldivar, the murder of Selena Quintanilla. Yolanda Saldivar began her connection to Selena Quintanilla as an enthusiastic fan. She worked as a nurse in Texas, but in the early 1990s, she became increasingly obsessed with Selena's music and career. She repeatedly contacted Selena's father, Abraham Quintanilla, asking for permission to start an official Selena fan club. After reviewing her background, the family approved it. Within a year, the fan club gained thousands of members, and Yolanda positioned herself as a loyal supporter and administrator. As Selena's fame grew, so did Yolanda's involvement. By 1994, Yolanda was handling not just the fan club, but also parts of Selena's boutique business. To the family, she appeared devoted and hardworking. But employees at the boutiques complained about her management style, claiming she was controlling, secretive, and often acted as if she owned the business. Selena, who naturally trusted people and avoided confrontation, continued to give Yolanda responsibility despite the growing concerns. Behind the scenes, money started disappearing. Boutique staff and fan club members reported missing payments, unreceived merchandise, and financial irregularities. Abraham Quintanilla investigated the accounts and quickly found evidence of embezzlement. He confronted Yolanda directly, removed her from her roles, and warned her to stay away from Selena. Yolanda denied everything, but the evidence was already overwhelming. Selena still felt conflicted. She believed Yolanda had been loyal in the past, and she wanted to recover important business documents Yolanda still refused to return. Selena met with her multiple times, trying to retrieve the records without escalating the situation. These meetings were tense, and Yolanda's behavior became increasingly unstable. She told Selena she felt sick, depressed, and even suggested she was suicidal. Selena, known for her kindness, tried to help her despite everything. On March 31st, 1995, Selena agreed to meet Yolanda at the Days Inn Motel in Corpus Christi. The plan was to collect the remaining financial documents and end the relationship entirely. The meeting quickly turned into an argument. Selena demanded the paperwork, and Yolanda continued to make excuses. Eventually, Selena managed to get some of the documents and attempted to leave the room. Yolanda grabbed a handgun she had purchased just weeks earlier. As Selena walked toward the door, Yolanda fired a single shot. The bullet struck Selena in the lower right shoulder, severing an artery. Critically wounded, Selena fled the room and ran down the motel hallway, leaving a trail of blood behind her. She collapsed in the lobby, but not before identifying Yolanda Saldivar as the shooter. Emergency medical staff rushed her to the hospital, but she was pronounced dead shortly after her arrival. She was 23 years old. After the shooting, Yolanda locked herself inside her pickup truck with the gun. For nearly 9 hours, she threatened to take her own life, while police negotiators tried to persuade her to surrender. The standoff was broadcast live across major news networks. Eventually, she exited the truck and was taken into custody without further incident. The murder devastated fans and left the Latino music community in shock. Selena was at the peak of her career, preparing for a major English-language crossover album that many believed would make her a global superstar. Her death immediately triggered nationwide memorials, tributes, and public mourning on a scale rarely seen for someone so young. Yolanda Saldivar's trial began later that year. The prosecution presented the financial motive, the deteriorating relationship, and the deliberate act of purchasing a firearm in the weeks leading up to the murder. They argued she feared losing control and influence once Selena removed her from the business. The defense claimed the shooting was accidental and that Yolanda never intended to kill her. The jury did not accept that explanation. On October 23, 1995, Yolanda Saldivar was found guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Her earliest parole eligibility date is in 2025. Despite the conviction, Yolanda has continued to give interviews over the years, insisting she never meant to harm Selena. None of those claims have changed public opinion. To fans and the Quintanilla family, the case is straightforward. Someone who gained access through trust exploited it, then turned violent when their control was threatened. Selena's legacy remains enormous. Her music continues to chart, her story is still told in documentaries and films, and she remains one of the most influential Latin artists in American history. Yolanda Saldivar, meanwhile, remains in a Texas prison, forever linked to one of the most tragic and unnecessary losses in modern music. Number 4. Colin Ferguson, the Long Island Rail. Road mass shooting. Colin Ferguson was born in Jamaica in 1958 and moved to the United States in the early 1980s. By all accounts, his early years were stable. He graduated from high school, attended college, and came from a middle-class family. But after relocating to America, his life began to deteriorate. He bounced between jobs, struggled financially, and slowly withdrew from the people around him. Over time, his behavior grew increasingly erratic, and he developed a deep resentment towards society. Friends, acquaintances, and co-workers all eventually backed away from him because of his unpredictable outbursts and fixation on racial grievances. By the early 1990s, Ferguson was living in California, unemployed and spiraling. He believed the government, employers, and multiple institutions had conspired against him. He filed lawsuits that were dismissed immediately, got into frequent arguments with strangers, and often talked about being wronged by people he barely knew. His worldview became dominated by paranoia. When he moved to New York in 1993, his mental state continued to decline, but he still managed to live independently and keep a low profile on paper. On December 7, 1993, Colin Ferguson boarded a Long Island Railroad commuter train heading toward Hicksville. As the train approached the Maryland Avenue station, he stood up, removed a handgun from his bag, and began firing at passengers in the car. There was no warning, and no one knew him. He moved down the aisle, shooting people row by row. 6 passengers were killed, and 19 others were wounded. It was one of the deadliest public transit attacks in United States history at the time. As the shooting unfolded, several passengers managed to tackle Ferguson when he stopped to reload. They pinned him to the floor and held him there until the train came to a stop and police boarded the car. Ferguson was arrested on the spot. Footage from that night shows officers escorting him from the train while stunned passengers tried to process what had just happened. The case moved quickly because the evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of witnesses saw the shooting. The gun was recovered at the scene, and Ferguson was detained immediately. But the trial became one of the most bizarre court proceedings of the decade. Instead of using a lawyer to defend him, Ferguson insisted on representing himself. The judge allowed it, despite widespread concern about his mental stability. During the trial in early 1995, Ferguson questioned his own victims while acting as his own attorney. He asked injured survivors whether they had seen the shooter, referring to the attack in the third person. He attempted to argue that a mysterious other man was responsible, even though he had been physically restrained by passengers with the weapon still in his hand. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, uncomfortable, and at times surreal. Footage from the televised trial shows victims visibly confused or distressed as Ferguson questioned them directly. Prosecutors laid out a simple and direct case. Ferguson boarded the train that evening, armed with a 9mm Ruger pistol, and carried 160 rounds of ammunition. He walked through the car, shooting randomly at passengers he didn't know. There was no evidence of a second suspect, no conspiracy, and no alternate explanation. They presented witness testimonies, physical evidence, ballistic analysis, and the immediate arrest. Once the state concluded its case, the outcome was effectively certain. In February 1995, Colin Ferguson was convicted on 6 counts of murder and 19 counts of attempted murder. He received a sentence of 315 years to life in prison, ensuring he would never be released. The judge called the attack one of the most senseless acts of violence the state had ever seen. The Long Island Railroad shooting had a major impact across New York. It pushed forward new discussions about mental health, gun control, and railway security. The bravery of the passengers who subdued Ferguson was widely praised, and several were honored for their actions. The case also became a strong example of what can go wrong when mentally unstable defendants represent themselves in court. Colin Ferguson remains incarcerated in the New York State prison system. He has repeatedly appealed his conviction, all unsuccessfully. The attack is still remembered today as one of the defining mass shootings of the early 1990s, and the footage from the trial continues to be referenced for how unusual and disturbing it was. Number 5. Jonathan Schmitz, the Jenny Jones Show murder. Jonathan Schmitz grew up in Michigan and lived what most people would consider an ordinary life. He worked steady jobs, kept a simple routine, and didn't have much of a criminal record. But he also struggled with mental health problems, insecurity, and emotional instability. Family members later described him as someone who had difficulty handling stress and rejection. Those issues, combined with a public embarrassment that he never expected, led to one of the most widely discussed media-related crimes of the 1990s. In early March 1995, Schmitz received a call from the Jenny Jones Show, a nationally televised daytime program known for its dramatic surprise segments. The producers told him someone had a secret crush on him and wanted to reveal it on air. Schmitz believed the admirer was a woman. He agreed to participate because he thought it would be flattering and harmless. He had no idea the situation would be different from what he expected. On March 6, 1995, Schmitz appeared on the show. When the segment began, he learned that the secret admirer was not a woman, but a man named Scott Amador. Amador was friendly, comfortable, and openly shared the crush in front of the live studio audience. The crowd laughed and cheered during the exchange. Schmitz seemed embarrassed, but played along. The footage shows him smiling awkwardly, covering his face, and trying to process the moment. What the audience didn't see was the internal reaction he was having. He later said he felt humiliated, confused, and blindsided. After the taping, the three men went their separate ways. Schmitz returned home to Michigan, but the event weighed heavily on him. According to testimony later presented in court, he felt mocked and believed the show had set him up for public embarrassment. His mental state declined rapidly in the days that followed. On March 9th, just 3 days after the show was filmed, Scott Amadeur left a note on Schmitz's door. The contents were not threatening, but when Schmitz read it, he became upset. Within hours, he drove to a bank, withdrew money, then went to a gun store and purchased a shotgun. He then drove to Amadeur's home. Amadeur answered the door. Schmitz asked him about the note. The conversation was brief. Moments later, Schmitz pulled out the shotgun and fired 2 rounds, killing Amadeur instantly. After the shooting, Schmitz drove to a nearby gas station and called 911 to report what he had done. The call was recorded, and he admitted the crime openly, saying he had been embarrassed and humiliated by the events of the show. The murder shocked the nation, not just because of the crime itself, but because of the television show's involvement. The Jenny Jones Show quickly became a focus of public outrage. Producers denied any wrongdoing, claiming Schmitz had not been forced to participate and had signed consent forms. However, questions arose about whether the program exploited vulnerable guests for ratings. The criminal case moved forward in 1996. The prosecution's argument was straightforward. Schmitz had acted out of anger, purchased a weapon, and driven directly to Amadeur's home with the intent to kill him. They emphasized the timeline, the bank withdrawal, and the purchase of the shotgun as proof of premeditation. The defense argued that Schmitz suffered from mental illness, including depression and Graves' disease, which can influence mood and behavior. They also claimed he had been pushed over the edge by the show's setup. Most controversially, his lawyers attempted to use what was then known as the gay panic defense, arguing that the embarrassment and unwanted attention triggered an unstable emotional response. The jury rejected that argument. In 1996, Jonathan Schmitz was convicted of second-degree murder and received a sentence of 25 to 50 years in prison. The Jenny Jones Show faced a separate civil lawsuit filed by Amadeur's family. In 1999, a jury found the show negligent and awarded the family a large settlement, though the judgment was later overturned on appeal. Today, the case remains one of the most frequently cited examples of talk show ethics controversies. The murder highlighted the risks of ambush-style television, where producers put guests in uncomfortable situations for entertainment. Schmitz was eventually paroled in 2017, after serving more than 20 years behind bars. The story is still referenced in documentaries and crime series, especially the Netflix episode From Trial by Media, which examined how the show's format contributed to the events. Even decades later, the case serves as a reminder of how quickly humiliation, mental instability, and media exploitation can escalate into violence. Number 6. O.J. Simpson. The trial of the century. Orenthal. James Simpson was already one of the most famous athletes in the United States by the time the events of 1994 unfolded. A former NFL superstar, a Heisman Trophy winner, and a well-known actor and broadcaster, O.J. Simpson lived a highly public lifestyle. His marriage to Nicole Brown Simpson had ended in 1992, and police had been called to the home multiple times over allegations of domestic violence. Their relationship was volatile and well documented long before the murder case began. On the night of June 12, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman were found dead outside Nicole's condo in Brentwood, Los Angeles. Both victims suffered multiple stab wounds, and investigators quickly concluded the attack was personal and extremely violent. Los Angeles police began piecing together the timeline and identified O.J. Simpson as the primary suspect almost immediately. Blood evidence, footprints, hair samples, and a bloody glove found on his property all tied him to the scene. Detectives arranged for O.J. to surrender, but instead, the situation escalated into one of the most televised moments in American history. On June 17, 1994, O.J. Simpson fled in a white Ford Bronco driven by his friend Al Cowlings. The low-speed chase was broadcast live across every major news network. Millions watched as the convoy moved down Los Angeles highways while police negotiated with O.J., who appeared to be suicidal during the event. After an hour-long pursuit, he returned to his home and surrendered without further incident. The Bronco chase became one of the most widely viewed events in television history. Once arrested, Simpson was charged with 2 counts of murder. The trial officially began on January 24, 1995, and was televised by Court TV every single day. It quickly became known as the trial of the century because of the scale of media coverage. Every courtroom moment was dissected on talk shows, in newspapers, and on nightly news broadcasts. The public followed every detail. The prosecution built its case around physical evidence. They presented blood samples collected from the crime scene, Simpson's car, and Simpson's home. DNA testing was still relatively new to the public at the time, but it strongly suggested O.J.'s involvement. The bloody glove found behind Simpson's guest house matched a glove from the crime scene. Prosecutors also highlighted Simpson's history of domestic violence as a potential motive. The defense took a very different approach, led by Johnny Cochran, Robert Shapiro, E.F. Lee Bailey, and other well-known attorneys. The defense argued that the Los Angeles Police Department had mishandled evidence, contaminated samples, and targeted Simpson unfairly. They suggested racism within the LAPD influenced the investigation. The most famous moment of the trial occurred when O.J. was asked to try on the bloody gloves. With cameras pointed directly at him, Simpson struggled to fit the gloves onto his hands. Cochran turned that moment into a defining line. "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." The trial lasted 134 days. Witnesses included detectives, forensic experts, domestic violence specialists, and people from both O.J. and Nicole's personal circles. The public reaction was massive, polarizing, and deeply tied to the media's nonstop coverage. Every development was broadcast live, and the case dominated the news cycle for almost an entire year. On October 3, 1995, the jury reached a verdict. O.J. Simpson was found not guilty on both counts of murder. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some viewers celebrated the verdict, while others were shocked. The trial highlighted differences in public perception across racial and social lines and became one of the most debated legal outcomes in American history. Although O.J. Simpson was acquitted in criminal court, he was later found liable for wrongful death in a 1997 civil lawsuit filed by the victims' families. The civil jury awarded a large financial judgment against him. Public opinion after the trial remained sharply split, and the debate over the evidence continues even decades later. The O.J. Simpson trial changed the way American media covered criminal cases. It set a new standard for televised courtrooms, public commentary, and how celebrity influence intersects with the justice system. Every key moment, from the Bronco chase to the glove demonstration, became embedded in American culture. O.J. Simpson lived a turbulent life after the trial, facing financial issues, legal problems, and eventually a prison sentence in Nevada in an unrelated robbery case. He was released on parole in 2017 and lived relatively quietly until his death in 2024. The trial of the century remains one of the most analyzed, studied, and discussed criminal cases ever recorded. The amount of footage, interviews, courtroom tapes, and public reaction makes it one of the most documented legal events in the modern era. Number 7. Terry Nichols, accomplice in the Oklahoma City bombing. Terry Lynn Nichols grew up in Lapeer, Michigan. He was soft-spoken, private, and never drew much attention. After high school, he took a few college classes, worked various jobs, and eventually enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1988. That decision changed the direction of his life because it was during basic training that he met Timothy McVeigh. The two became close friends, bonding over shared anti-government views and a deep distrust of federal authority. After both men left the military, they stayed in contact, and their conversations gradually shifted from frustration to action. Nichols left the Army early and never found stable work. He moved between states, held temporary jobs, and struggled financially. His personal life was turbulent as well. He married twice, lived in multiple places, and often seemed to depend on others for support. During the early 1990s, his political beliefs hardened. He studied anti-government literature, attended meetings with like-minded groups, and became convinced that the federal government was becoming oppressive. The Ruby Ridge incident in 1992 and the Waco siege in 1993 intensified these beliefs for both Nichols and McVeigh. By 1994, McVeigh began openly discussing a plan to attack a federal building. Nichols did not stop him. Instead, he helped gather materials. Court records show that Nichols purchased ammonium nitrate, stored supplies, and helped assemble components used to construct the truck bomb. He rented storage units, bought equipment, and participated in the planning meetings. Although McVeigh was the one who physically carried out the bombing on April 19, 1995, Nichols remained deeply involved behind the scenes. The bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building killed 168 people, including 19 children, and wounded hundreds more. The explosion destroyed 1/3 of the 9-story building and became the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. While McVeigh was arrested within 90 minutes of the attack during a routine traffic stop, Nichols was not immediately taken into custody. Investigators began tracing the bomb materials, rental truck, and storage units, and Nichols's name surfaced repeatedly. On April 21, 1995, Nichols walked into a Kansas police station and turned himself in. He denied direct involvement, but admitted he knew McVeigh and had helped him obtain materials. Agents searched the Nichols home and storage units, finding blasting caps, manuals, and handwritten notes that connected him to the preparations. Over the next 2 years, prosecutors built a detailed timeline showing Nichols's role in helping McVeigh gather supplies, build the bomb, and coordinate the overall plan. Nichols's federal trial began in 1997. The prosecution focused on his participation prior to the attack. They presented receipts for ammonium nitrate, testimony from family members, financial records, and documents showing Nichols had repeatedly traveled with McVeigh in the months leading up to April 1995. The defense argued that Nichols stepped away from the plot before the bombing and never intended for anyone to be harmed. They claimed he acted out of misguided loyalty to McVeigh rather than shared intent. The jury didn't fully accept either narrative. In December 1997, Nichols was convicted on federal charges of conspiracy and involuntary manslaughter. He avoided the death penalty, but received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. However, that wasn't the end of his legal troubles. The state of Oklahoma pursued its own case against him, charging him with 161 counts of first-degree murder, one for each victim recovered from the Murrah building. That trial began in 2004. Once again, prosecutors laid out his involvement. They argued that Nichols was not just an assistant, but an essential partner who enabled McVeigh to execute the attack. The evidence mirrored the federal case, but focused more on the human toll. Family members of victims testified, and the destruction of the building was examined in detail. Nichols was convicted again and received a second life sentence. Today, Terry Nichols is serving multiple life sentences in a federal supermax prison. He spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement and has almost no contact with the outside world. He has repeatedly filed appeals and legal petitions over the years, all unsuccessful. Unlike McVeigh, Nichols has never received the same level of media attention, but his role in the Oklahoma City bombing remains significant. Without his assistance gathering materials, storing supplies, and supporting the planning process, the attack could not have occurred in the way it did. The case stands as a clear example of how a person who never plants the bomb or pulls the trigger can still be held responsible for catastrophic violence. Nichols' involvement shows how conspiracy, preparation, and support can carry consequences just as severe as the actions of the principal offender. Number 8. Jesse Timandequas, the case that created Megan's Law. Jesse Timandequas lived in Hamilton Township, New Jersey during the early 1990s. He had a long criminal record involving offenses against minors, but at the time, there were no public databases or community notification systems for high-risk offenders. This meant neighbors had no easy way to know who was living nearby, and Timandequas stayed largely unnoticed in a quiet residential area. He shared a house with 2 other individuals who also had past convictions. Directly across the street lived the Kanka family, who were unaware of the backgrounds of the people living near them. Their 7-year-old daughter, Megan, often played outside like most kids in the neighborhood. Nothing about the area suggested danger, and families trusted that their street was safe. On July 29, 1994, Megan was outside near her home when Timandequas approached her. According to investigators, he used an excuse to get her to come toward his house. When she didn't come back home shortly afterward, her parents reported her missing. Police launched an immediate search, interviewing neighbors and checking the surrounding area. During questioning, officers noticed inconsistencies in Timandequas' statements and behavior. That raised suspicion, and as investigators pressed him for details, he eventually informed them of what had happened. He also directed law enforcement to the location where he had left Megan after the incident. The discovery confirmed that the case had turned from a missing child search into a homicide investigation. The community was devastated. The idea that an individual with a known high-risk history had been living directly across from a family with no warning sparked national outrage. People questioned how someone with a documented record could live near children without the community being notified. Megan's parents stated publicly that if they had known about their neighbor's past, they would have taken precautions. The trial began in 1997. Prosecutors focused on Timandequas' confession, his prior record, and the investigative findings. The defense attempted to challenge parts of the confession and pointed to mental health factors, but the evidence remained strong. He was convicted in May 1997 and originally received the death penalty. Years later, when New Jersey abolished capital punishment in 2007, his sentence was changed to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated today. The impact of the case went far beyond the conviction. Public pressure after Megan's death led New Jersey legislators to create what became known as Megan's Law. It required convicted sex offenders to register with local authorities after release and allowed communities to receive notifications about high-risk individuals moving into their area. Within a short time, every state in the country adopted similar laws. It became one of the most significant child protection reforms in modern American history. Footage from the time includes news updates, community press conferences, interviews with the Kanka family, statewide legislative hearings, and courtroom coverage. The case continues to be referenced whenever public safety and offender registration laws are discussed. Today, the name Jesse Timandequas is mostly associated with the major legal changes that followed. Megan's Law reshaped how communities stay informed and is still in effect across the United States. The case remains a reminder of why those protections were created and how one tragedy can reshape national policy. Number 9. Robert Bardo, the stalking and murder of Rebecca Schaefer. Robert John Bardo grew up in Tucson, Arizona. He had a difficult childhood marked by instability, limited social connections, and long-term emotional struggles. By his teenage years, he developed an intense interest in television personalities. He frequently wrote letters to actors and public figures, often becoming fixated on individuals he saw on screen. His family later said they had tried to get him consistent mental health support, but he continued to drift deeper into obsessive behavior. In the late 1980s, Bardo became focused on Rebecca Schaefer, a young actress who starred in the TV show My Sister Sam. She was known for her friendly personality, her rising career, and her positive public image. Bardo identified with her character and convinced himself they shared a personal connection. Even though the two had never met, he attempted to visit her on studio property multiple times but was turned away by security. His fixation escalated when he saw her appear in a film with a more mature role. Bardo misinterpreted the scene and began feeling betrayed, despite having no relationship with her. This shift in attitude marked a turning point in his behavior. Bardo searched for Rebecca Schaefer's home address. At the time, there were limited privacy protections for public figures, and he was able to obtain her address through a private investigator who accessed her DMV records. This vulnerability in the system would later lead to major legal reform. On July 18, 1989, Bardo traveled to her Los Angeles home. When Rebecca answered the door, he spoke to her briefly. She was polite but confused by the unexpected visit and ended the conversation. Bardo left, walked around the neighborhood for a short time, and then returned to her apartment again. When Rebecca opened the door the second time, the encounter became fatal. Bardo immediately fled the scene and traveled back to Arizona, where he was arrested the following day after family members contacted police. The investigation was straightforward. Witnesses identified Bardo, security footage placed him in the area, and he had made previous attempts to meet Rebecca in person. Detectives also found letters and writings that documented his fixation. His confession and the physical evidence made the case against him clear. In 1991, Robert Bardo was convicted of first-degree murder. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole and remains incarcerated at a California state prison. The impact of the case was enormous. Rebecca Schaefer was only 21 years old, and she was viewed as one of Hollywood's most promising young actresses. Her death created an industry-wide push for stronger privacy and anti-stalking protections. Lawmakers reacted quickly. California passed significant reforms restricting public access to DMV information, and new anti-stalking legislation was introduced nationwide. The protections that exist today for celebrities, public figures, and everyday individuals can be traced directly back to this case. News coverage from the time includes courtroom footage, interviews with Rebecca's colleagues, and discussions about the need for new safety laws. Over the years, the case has been featured in crime documentaries and programs examining the evolution of stalking laws in the United States. Robert Bardo's name is now mostly associated with the lasting legal changes his crime triggered. Rebecca Schaefer's legacy lives on through those protections, which continue to safeguard individuals from similar forms of obsessive behavior and unlawful pursuit. Number 10. Glenn Rogers, the cross-country killer. Glenn Edward Rogers was born in Hamilton, Ohio, in 1962. His early life was marked by instability, frequent moves, and ongoing family problems. By his teenage years, he had dropped out of school and developed a long pattern of getting in trouble. He lived a transient lifestyle, traveling from state to state, working short-term jobs, and drifting through relationships that almost always ended badly. Over time, his behavior escalated. Police in multiple states recorded incidents involving theft, fraud, and violent outbursts. By the early 1990s, Rogers had become known for his ability to charm people quickly and then disappear without warning. He often used different names and stayed in motels or with acquaintances he met along the way. Because he moved constantly, law enforcement had difficulty tracking his activities across state lines. Between 1994 and 1995, several women he had met in different states were later found dead under suspicious circumstances. Investigators eventually connected Rogers through witness statements, travel records, and physical evidence. Each time, he had met the victim shortly before the crime occurred, then left the area almost immediately. This pattern earned him the nickname the cross-country killer. In November 1995, Rogers was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Footage from the time shows news alerts, warnings issued by multiple police departments, and nationwide coverage. He was considered extremely dangerous because of how quickly he formed connections with strangers and how unpredictable his behavior had become. On November 13, 1995, Rogers was arrested in Kentucky after a short vehicle pursuit. When police took him into custody, they found items linking him to several of the ongoing investigations. Once in custody, detectives from Florida, California, Mississippi, and other states began coordinating their cases. Rogers made multiple statements during interrogations, some confessing to crimes and others exaggerating or contradicting previous claims. Investigators had to sort through what was factual and what wasn't. The strongest case against him came from Florida. In 1997, he stood trial for the killing of Tina Marie Cribbs. Prosecutors presented witness testimony, hotel records, and evidence found in Rogers's possession. The defense argued that his statements were unreliable due to his mental state and that there were inconsistencies in witness accounts. The jury was not convinced. Rogers was convicted in Florida and received a death sentence. He was later convicted in California as well, adding another death sentence to his record. Despite this, he has continued to appeal and has made numerous claims over the years, including alleging involvement in other high-profile cases. Most of these claims have been dismissed by investigators as either impossible or unsupported by evidence. Today, Glenn Rogers remains on death row. His case continues to appear in crime documentaries because of the number of states involved, the difficulty investigators had in comparing cases across jurisdictions, and the long trail of suspicious activity he left behind as he crossed the country. Some documentaries have focused on his later claims, including attempts to link himself to the 1994 deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. But law enforcement has stated repeatedly that there is no credible evidence supporting those claims. The story of Glenn Rogers is often used as an example of how dangerous a transient offender can be when moving from state to state before agencies had modern communication tools. The investigations that followed his arrest helped push forward improvements in how police departments share information, track suspects, and connect cases that occur hundreds of miles apart.